Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to go through some Kubernetes troubleshooting examples. So I'm assuming you know a little bit about Kubernetes and you are already using it in a production system. So when you use Kubernetes in a production system, there is always a chance that something goes wrong. And in this video I'm going to go through certain scenarios which you may encounter in future. I'm going to go through total 6 scenarios. These are by no means an exhaustive list, but these are only from my experience. So let's start. So before I go through the individual scenarios, one point about Kubernetes is that ideally you should be notified about any trouble occurring in your cluster before your application user is affected or as soon as he is affected. So you can achieve that by having monitoring systems such as using Prometheus or Grafana and set up your system in such a way that if something goes wrong, you are immediately notified either in the form of a Slack notification or by a phone call if it is absolutely important. So once you are notified and you know that something goes wrong, then there are certain things you can do. So one of the first things you would do is to check if your pods are running fine. So you normally would do kubectl get pods followed by whatever is your namespace, and then you may see that one of the pods is getting restarted all the time. And if you do a describe, so kubectl describe pod followed by your pod name followed by the namespace, then it may look something like this at the very beginning, where you will see the reason being OOMKilled. So this is the first case scenario we're going to cover. So OOMKilled basically means so your pod has certain limited resources, and if it utilizes all the memory, then it gets killed and then it restarts. So there are two possible reasons for that. So one thing is obviously that you probably set less memory than it actually needs. So what you can do is you edit your deployment and increase the available memory. So you can do that by doing kubectl edit deployment followed by your deployment name followed by your namespace, and then you can manually increase the memory. So that is one scenario. OOMKilled can also occur if you introduced a bug in your code. So what can happen due to that bug, that might be a memory leak, and due to that it will always get OOMKilled no matter how much memory you set. So in that case you will actually need to go through the code to fix it. Okay, so the next scenario is what if there is a sudden jump in load in your application. So if a lot of people suddenly start to use your application, or for some reason your application starts to refresh more often than it normally does, and this may create extra pressure on your backend services. So in that case, there are two possible things one can do. First is simply to increase the CPU, following the same procedure as you do to increase the memory. That is one thing. Second thing is simply you can increase the number of instances. So that is usually the preferred way to go about things. So you can basically scale your service by doing kubectl scale deployment followed by a deployment name, and you can set the number of replicas, so which is basically the number of pods. And ideally you should not be having to do manual stuff when the load increases if you have set up an autoscaler in place. So Kubernetes already gives an autoscaler which is called horizontal pod autoscaler, or HPA, and there you can set some criteria about how to scale. So one option you have is basically if the CPU utilization is beyond certain percentage, then you create another instance, and so on. So this is one of the functionalities which Kubernetes provides. If you want more advanced way to autoscale, which basically means you may need to scale your services based on some other metric, which is different than just CPU. You may need a combination of metrics, and based on that you need to autoscale. So in that case you have to write a service which basically connects to your Kubernetes cluster, so by using your Kubernetes API. So for example, for Go there is a Kubernetes Go API. So using that API you can actually connect to the cluster and then calculate the metric, and based on that you can scale. So that gives full functionality or full freedom to you if you want to scale based on your custom requirements. but you have to be careful about certain things like service accounts or the permissions you give. So that's a bit more advanced thing. Okay, so the next scenario is rollbacks. So if you recently deployed or you recently made a change to your code base and deployed, and all of a sudden you are seeing outages and you can't figure it out what to do, then one of the immediate things you should do is basically to do a rollback, which will roll your service back to the previous version of your application, which was hopefully running fine. So you can see a history of your of the versions by doing this command kubectl rollout history deployment followed by your deployment name, and it will look something like this, where you see the revisions followed by whatever is the change cause. And in this case, the revision 4 is the latest one. So if you know the previous one was working fine, then you can do this command. So kubectl rollout undo deployment followed by deployment name to revision 3, and then it will roll back to that particular revision. So, and how much of history does Kubernetes save? That depends on what is the revision history limit you have set before, and that you can set in your deployment YAML file. So ideally, you don't have to do this that manually. So one example is if you have a CI/CD pipelines, for example, Circle CI. So in that case, it is basically a one-click thing. In this case, what I went through, this is basically a manual thing. You have to do like 2 or 3 things, and basically you have to be sure about which revision to pick, and that is something that at least I don't regularly do in production systems. So the ideal scenario is basically to go to Circle CI or whatever CI/CD pipeline you use and go to that dashboard, and then simply click on a revision which you know for sure used to work properly, and that revision might be the second most recent version of your master branch, for example. So in that case, you have more control and it's just easier to do rather than using a command like this. Okay, so the fourth thing you can do is to actually check logs. So if your application is failing and you have tried other things and you still can't figure out what is going wrong, then you can simply look at the logs of a pod. So the command is basically kubectl logs followed by the pod name followed by the namespace as well. And in case the pod has restarted, so the old pod isn't available anymore, and you want to see the logs of the previous pod, then you just need to give this previous flag to see. Okay, so next thing you can do is to, if let's say your pod is running fine, it's not constantly restarting, and but there is still some problem, you can basically SSH into that pod itself, assuming it supports. So the command is kubectl exec -it, so basically interactive in a terminal, followed by your pod name, followed by sh. So this will open a bash shell inside your pod, and then you are actually inside the pod, so you can check networking stuff, or you can check a local file inside the pod, or you can check a local log inside the pod if you are saving the logs inside the pod itself. So that gives you slightly more number of options to be able to check what is exactly going wrong and to successfully troubleshoot. Okay, so the next scenario is CrashLoopBackOff. So this is one of the more popular scenarios, trouble scenarios in Kubernetes. You will see it a lot of times if you work on Kubernetes a lot. So this you will see basically if you are doing a kubectl get pods, and you will see a pod name like that, and you'll see its status to be CrashLoopBackOff. And there can be many reasons for this CrashLoopBackOff. So I have written down like 3 or 4 case scenarios, but there can be other scenarios as well. So one obvious thing is if you have some issue with your Docker file. So if your Docker file doesn't have a command basically, so if it doesn't know what to do after starting up, so it basically finishes the task and then restarts because it has done its work, so it just exits. So that is one scenario. If you have, let's say, the same port number for 2 different containers, then also it can happen. If Kubernetes can't pull the image you specified, then also it can happen. And And yeah, you should check the logs if you can't figure this out even after checking all this stuff. And if you still can't figure out, then maybe you can consider deploying your application with a sleep command for a few minutes so that you get just enough time to see the logs. This is a very hacky way to check it. So if you are testing things out, then you can of course try this. Okay, so this was a short summary of some of the trouble scenarios and how you can troubleshoot. So feel free to comment if you know any more scenarios or if something was wrong and if you know a better way to solve these scenarios. So thank you.